Hi, Greens. This is Howard Schweitzer, and I wanted to talk to you about monetary reform today because there seems to be a lot of confusion out there about monetary reform, a lot of misinformation about monetary reform. And a lot of that is coming from videos being put out by MMT proponents. Now, you may or may not know we defeated an MMT effort to eliminate monetary reform from our platform last summer. And after that defeat, it seems like they are now going to state parties to try and get them to appoint delegates who would vote against monetary reform. And I think that would be a real shame because I don't think Greens understand it very well. And why would MMT want to eliminate that from our platform is very curious to me, since Greens hadn't really been talking about monetary reform much besides me. And also they kind of frame it as if it was my idea, you know, and call me names and stuff like that out there. I was kind of thrilled to be called names on videos that were being watched by people, because you see, when you're attacked personally, it means that your argument really has no substance to it. And I think that's an important point. And the other point I'd like to make is that whether it's MMT or monetary reform, what's it going to take to make it happen? And of course, that's where we come in. It's got to be a big movement, a big political movement, you know, so a movement with a political arm that can elect ethical people to Congress who will implement the spending that we want. Now, if it's MMT, they can just do it without having to do any legislation because they say, a sovereign system. I think they would find that we are not a sovereign system, and therefore would need legislation, and that's where our proposal comes in, which would just take, Congress would just have to make some legislation to make it possible for them to issue the money. Because right now it's funded by taxing and borrowing, even though there's MMT people say there's not, but there's no evidence of what they say, and there's lots of evidence of what we are saying. And I want to share a little bit of that with you, along with the history. Now, recently, a fella that I know, an MMT proponent, a fella I've known for some time, related to monetary reform, told me that, well, MMT and monetary reform are the same thing, and that I just don't understand the economic and academic jargon that they use. Well, my feeling is, if you can't explain what you're talking about in plain language that everybody can understand, you're not much use, because our public, general public, needs to understand what monetary reform is so that we can move to having it. So I think it's very important that we all understand, that Greens all understand in very plain language what monetary reform means and what modern money means, actually. And so I have a slideshow I'd like to share with you, and to talk about this kind of stuff and give you a little bit of history of the greening of the dollar that you may or may not know. And so let's see if I can share my screen here with my slideshow here. And okay, here we go. That's me still up in the corner, so I'm not leaving you. And Green Man, yes, I've used this icon somewhat, and I plan to do some more videos to explain more detail on monetary reform, how the system works and that. But for now, let's just take a look here at, the financial crisis of 2008 occurred because there were no constraints on the private financial system creation of private money as credit. In other words, there was no constraints on the banks lending money, making loans, that is, increasing debt for people. And that's what caused the financial crisis. It wasn't government, except that government didn't impose any restraints on the private banking sector. And so that's what caused the problem. It's not the first time we've had a problem with that either. It's happened a number of times. So in response to this, some members of the Green Party looked into what the solution would be. How do we stop the banks from doing that? And they discovered monetary reform is the way you stop the banks from doing that. And so that required 3 basic reforms. And one was to nationalize the Federal Reserve. Now, we don't say eliminate the Federal Reserve, because there are elements to that that are important, and they should be in the U.S. Treasury. Right now, the Fed system is a private system. There's a lot of argument about that because it has a federal government name, and it's kind of a partnership between the government and the financial corporations. But if you look at the Fed, all its employees are bank employees. They're not government employees. The Board of Governors, it's all paid for by the banks, not the government. There's no government employees involved with the Fed whatsoever. Okay, so it's a private business, you know, it's a private enterprise. The Open Market Committee too, same way, it's all private. And the 12 Federal Reserve banks around the country are all owned by the commercial banks in those regions. So how is it a public, it's not a public agency. Greenspan told us that, right? So there you have that. So we want to nationalize the Federal Reserve System, and we want to end the bank creation of money, because that's what causes the problem. And we want the federal government to create and issue money, sovereign money, which MMT says we already do, but we really don't, because if we did, we wouldn't have the problems we have now, right, frankly. And so, but that's not, you know, and of course we want to fund the Green New Deal. That's and the platform. We all want the same thing. If we're all progressives, we all want to implement the Green Platform, right, and the Green New Deal. We want, there's, you know, that's really a great start to creating a fair and equitable society, which is what I assume we all want together. We need to get together to do that, because it's going to take an enormous and an extraordinary human collaboration to pull it off. I want to point out that in the Green New Deal, under real financial reform, we have democratized monetary policy to bring about public control of the money supply and credit creation, right? That's monetary reform. That's the things that we are proposing. This means we'll nationalize the private bank-dominated Federal Reserve and place them under a monetary authority within the Treasury Department. Now, to explain that monetary authority would be in the Treasury, and they would scientifically determine, using, you know, production figures, using, actually they should use the GPI, the Genuine Progress Index, and other scientific means to determine how much money should be created. And of course, quite a lot of money can be created at first, because all the new money has been going into the speculative economy and not the production economy. You know, the production economy has been starved of money, and that's where we all live, and that's why we all have these problems of inequity. And I'm going to want to talk about that inequity here in a bit too, because that's a real important thing. You know, we were not alone in that response to the 2008 crisis. There's more than 30 groups, for instance, in the International Monetary Movement who also responded to that crisis with, oh, well, let's fix the money system, you know. And there are economists who recognize that. Today, not very many. But back in the 30s, there was a bunch of them. And, but also, it was a response by Dennis Kucinich, who proposed the NEAT Act. And he brought that forth to Congress, the 112th Congress, and introduced that. It never got out of committee, but that would have changed the whole system. That would have, it's because it has the same three elements as in the Green Party platform. Same three elements in all of these other groups world around, like Positive Money and Ons Geld in Belgium or in the Netherlands, and Monetative in Germany, Italy, all the many 30-some countries now have groups that are pushing for these same three reforms. And it's an important thing to do. So we've already got legislation written to do it. It's already been vetted by the Legislative Legal Counsel, you know, and the Fed lawyers and everything. They've gone over all of this to make sure that it addresses all the laws that need to be changed in order to do this. So, you know, money is an element of the law. It's a social power given to us by law. And there's a history to that. I can share more with that later. But the 2008 crash was a big crash, and it was often compared to the Great Depression crash, you know, the crash in 29. And that was caused intentionally by the Fed banks. And in fact, the Pecora Commission investigated it and proved that. And still, as in 2008, nobody was prosecuted, right? Because government really has no power. Now, a lot of people want to say, oh, the government is the most powerful entity in the world. But is it really? How come we just had a government shutdown? Because, you know, they wouldn't borrow any money to keep it open. You know, who made that decision really? You know, who puts the candidates that we elect in office? Who funds their campaigns? Who funds the two political parties that duke it out all the time, left and right, and implement the banker's agenda every time, the financial agenda? The banks were investigated, in fact, in 1912 by the Pujo Committee, the money trust that was pushing for the private central bank known as the Fed. So it's been going on for a while. Well, when they crashed the economy, and all they had to do was stop lending money, you see. They lend money and create a big bubble, and when you stop lending money, boom, it crashes because nobody has any money. You know, and it can happen also if loan payments exceed loans being made. And so we have these little recessions that happen all along the way too. But occasionally the bankers say, have a big enough bubble. They say, oh, let's crash it and we'll get all that wealth that's been held in collateral, which is land and businesses and millions of homes and banks. There were 400 banks in the last one that got transferred to the big banks. And a couple of them were very big banks, right? Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. But in 1929, there were 4,000 community banks that were absorbed by the big banks and all their assets, along with the homes and the farms, millions of farms. That was their main target, was getting hold of the land, which is what is often used as collateral for loans. And of course, they presented us a solution to this, which was a program for monetary reform. And there were some 400 economists around the world who all supported this and said, yes, this is what we need to do to stop it. You know why? Because they were a little ticked off that the banks would do that on purpose. And so that's why they came up with this. They said, okay, well, you know, we've got to take their power away from them. But that's easier said than done, obviously. And of course, that's what the American Revolution was about too. They were trying to get free of the Bank of England. You know, the Crown didn't have any power after 1694. After 1694, it was the Bank of England who was in control of things, of public policy. You know, the king was a figurehead. And so it was the Bank of England that we were revolting against in the Revolutionary War. And the reason we were revolting against the Bank of England was because the colonies had figured out money. It was a trial and error process over some time, you know, 100 years or so, trying to figure out money, because there were a lot of economic hardships in early America. But once they figured out money, they started getting prosperous. And so the Bank of England, Ben Franklin went over, and the Bank of England, the Lords were asking him, well, you know, the House of Lords, they were basically the stockholders of the Bank of England. And they were asking him, well, how come you guys have so much prosperity? And he bragged. He said, well, it's because we have our own money system, that we issue paper money publicly for public projects, and that money goes into the economy and continues to circulate and creates prosperity. Well, so they made it illegal, right? And that plunged the nation into a deep depression. And while states still tried to issue money, you know, people were arrested and all of this kind of stuff. So they shut it down. And so that's what eventually precipitated the Civil War, or the American Revolution, which was funded by money created by the Continental Congress, public money, paper money called the Continental Currency. And that's what funded the American Revolution for 6 years. It was a 6-year war, and it actually only funded about 5.5 years of it, because Britain was counterfeiting the Continental Currency and to debase it, to lower its value. And, you know, Washington's troops would catch a wagon load of them once in a while, you know, of counterfeit continental currencies. And so, you know, eventually they got it to be, you know, a tiny fraction of what its original worth was. And we started talking to France about borrowing money from France. But before we ever got much money from France, we won the war militarily. We won militarily, but we lost monetarily. I'll explain that in a minute. But but as Ben Franklin said, the viability of Congress to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of the international bankers, and he was really referring to the Bank of England. It was headquartered, the international bankers were headquartered in London at the time. Before that, they were in Amsterdam. Before that, they were in Antwerp. You know, before that, they were in Genoa when they first started, you know, doing these investments of funding expeditions to go rob other countries of their resources and their gold. And so we had the American Revolution. But we lost monetarily because there was a power struggle after that war. And Thomas Jefferson, who was a farmer, and Alexander Hamilton, who was a banker. And of course, when farmers and bankers duke it out, you know, usually the bankers have won, right? That's why the Bank of North Dakota happened, because after the Fed was established, they said, we want to protect ourselves from those private bankers. And so that's why that bank was created, was to protect themselves from the banking system that was implemented. But you see, Jefferson wanted the issuing power to be with the government to issue the money. And Hamilton wanted to be with the banks to issue the money, the private banks to issue the money. And I expect there was quite a bit of money involved, exchanging hands, that got Congress to approve letting private banks issue the money. So the people lost monetarily. There's so much wonderful history too. When you start studying the history of money, you're really studying the history of power. But it was recognized in ancient Greece 10 centuries before Christ that the most vital prerogative of government was to issue the money. You see, that they figured it out then too. And of course, they had already been under the thumb of oligarchs. You know, Western civilization, you know, probably one of the most salient features of Western civilization is rule by the wealthiest people. I mean, when in history can we point to where we were not ruled by the wealthiest? Where in Western civilization? Well, there were very few instances, and one was for a short period of time, 350 years, in ancient Greece, where they were issuing their own money. It was actually just Sparta that was doing it, but they learned about it. But it's interesting that here I wanted to point these pictures out. You know, the icon of the banks is the Greek temple. And that's because people would bring their wealth to the temple. And so the temple became great stores of wealth. And they brought them for, you know, to pray for the crops and to pray for well-being and for health. So health was an important factor. And we have the staff of Asclepius on here. It's often referred to as representing the medical field. But you can see the dollar sign in it too, because the staff represents law, which is what money is established by. And the snake represents fertility and transformation, which of course money, it is fertile, an exchange medium. So good for the people. And so just a little tidbit there. Anyway, I often make a joke about this guy looking like Bob Dylan, but this is Benjamin Disraeli. He was the first prime minister of England, elected in 1844. And he said, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. Who was he referring to? He was referring to the Bank of England, those who control the government of England. And he's sad because, you see, he was elected to power and discovered he had no power. He was not in charge. And neither are the U.S. presidents in charge. Obama showed you that very clearly if you were paying attention. Yanis Varoufakis found out too, right? He was elected the finance minister of Greece because he wanted to change economic policies, but he went to a meeting with the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is the big banks who are behind the European Central Bank, just like we have big private banks behind the Fed, they have big private banks behind the Eurogroup and or behind the European Central Bank. And when he was introduced to the group of bankers there that he was meeting with, the president pushed his nameplate forward and he said, elections cannot be allowed to change the economic policies of any country. Now, obviously, Yanis was, I'm sure, surprised about that. And because that's what he came there to do, was talk about changing the economic policy. So that pretty much ended the meeting, you know. There wasn't really much to talk about at that point. And isn't that an expression of the power that we have in this world? Because the monetary system is a global system. It's the same everywhere. I mean, everywhere money is issued as credit, as debt. That's the way it is. That's the current system. And it's not a conspiracy. It's just the way the system works. It's just the global monetary system. Salvador Allende found that out. You know, they won the revolution. As he said, we won the revolution, but we have not won the power. That's right. He didn't win the power. He didn't win the right, the sovereign right for their government to issue their own money, to control their own economy and their own resources. That's what it's about. It's about reaping the resources off of other countries. That's because we have a monetary system that extracts wealth from everybody and sends it to the top few who control the system, the big capital holders. As Dick Durbin famously said also, the bankers frankly own the place. That's our government. Right? The debt-based monetary system is the major contributor to adverse economic conditions in the world. It is the main factor. And it enforces an artificial scarcity of money in the productive economy and a bloated, huge amount in the speculative economy where the rich play. Well, we have formed a Banking and Monetary Reform Committee, and our mission is to educate Greens as well as to educate Green candidates, very important. So when they're asked, how do we pay for it, they can explain it in plain language. And also we want to educate the public, because it's going to take the public getting behind us and getting behind monetary reform to change this system so that we can address the inequality. And inequality is a very important factor, because inequality, when inequality is high, right-wing movements emerge, and that's what's happening today, right? We have extreme inequality and right-wing movements emerging. A little bit of history on that. As Kenneth Gelber says, the problem with the modern economy is not a failure of knowledge of economics. It's a failure of knowledge of history. And about that history, in the 30s, there were the left and right, excuse me, the left and right was duking it out. And there were fights in the bars between leftists and the right that turned into street brawls, you know, rolled out into the street. And this was happening in Germany. This was happening in Italy. And what happens when the left opposes the right with violence? The right-wing movements get stronger. And that's what happened in Italy and Germany. They got strong enough to elect dictators in charge. Well, we've got some polarization going on in the U.S. now, and what happened? We elected a dictator. Remains to be seen if he will remain a dictator. We'll see. But at that same time, in the 30s, when that was going on in Europe, in the Nordic countries, the left did not engage the right in fistfights. Instead, they said, look at the top. It's those bankers. They're the ones that are causing this pain, this inequality, this economic stress that we're all experiencing. It's them. It's the bankers. And by doing that, they were able to knock the elite off their pedestal in their country, and they got the wonderful social democracies that we've often been a bit jealous of, you know. And that's how that happened, is because they did not engage the right in fighting. Instead, they brought the right along to focus on the top, to topple the top. That's what we need to do. But the study of money above all other fields, as Ken said, is one in which complexity is used to disguise or evade truth, not to reveal it. So if you're hearing language that isn't clear, that you don't quite understand, That's what's going on. They're trying to hide simple truths, okay? And not only that, they're using it to claim sophistication. You know, highly educated people only understand this, you know. You don't understand the economic jargon. Hello. Sorry. The global wealth distribution. This is what we got now. And it's extreme. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? And yet 80% of the population down here, the small portion or the largest portion of the population, that's where all the art and innovation comes from. That's where all the value is produced. But it's ripped off by a monetary system that systematically puts it to the top. Now, here's the thing. These are all made up of people doing their jobs. This system is. It's a system that they got hired in to do. The system has, you know, the people come and go. They live and die. It's not the people doing that know what's going on. A lot of the people there, I bet there's even people who are benefit at the top who don't even know how the system works. They think God is giving them all that money. That they are, you know, they think it's God. It's not, but it's the system. It's the system we have that gives them that tremendous benefit. And all the people who have jobs within it, and some of those jobs are protect the system. That's what some of those jobs are meant to do. And like economists, protect the system, protect the existing status quo issuing of money as debt or credit. Princeton University study, right, showed us that the public had no influence on public policy. What does? Money. It's money. So money is the problem, and money is what we need to focus on. Because here's 200 of the most politically active companies, this is over a 10-year period, invested $5.8 billion in influencing government. And they reaped $4 trillion in taxpayer subsidies and support. What is that, like a 600 ROI, return on investment? That's a massive return on your investment, right? So that was money well spent by these corporations. And they, the study broke it down into 6 major corporate areas: pharmaceutical, energy, defense, communication, agribusiness, and finance. But I want to point something out to you. Finance is the biggest contributor. They're the biggest contributor. And not only that, but those pharmaceutical, energy, defense, and communication, all those corporations require a tremendous amount of credit to run their operations. And where do they get that credit? From the finance industry. So they're all in debt to the finance industry too. And what they are, corporations, are just the wealth extracting mechanism for the finance industry. And that wealth goes in because they're paying their debt, right? And it's going to the finance industry. And that little top keeps getting higher. There is more debt in the world than there is money to pay it. And the rich thing, we've got the best system in the world. We get paid to be rich. That's a line that I got from this movie that you all should watch sometime. It's fun. It's called The Cradle Will Rock. And there was this scene in there with Rockefeller and Warburg and, you know, all the big rich guys at the time, laughing and clinking glasses. And that's a quote from them, that we've got the best system in the world. Ha, ha, ha. We get paid to be rich. And they certainly do. By the system. They don't have to do anything, but they take advantage of it for sure. Because that influence is a greed influence, and it influences them to be greedy. It's like winning at Monopoly. You know, the Monopoly game was designed to show how wealth influences your behavior. And so the winners always, they tend to get a little obnoxious, right? That's what happens in the Monopoly game. It's also to show that bankers always win. And they certainly do, because they control the money. And it's the money is the problem, right? And so here you have a cartoon from 1912, right? And you have the big commercial bankers on one side and the Wall Street investment bankers on the other. And they're saying, you know, well, which one you want to win this time, the Republicans or the Democrats? You know, well, give the Democrats 2 turns, give the Republicans 2 turns. Ain't it the way? Well, it wouldn't have to be that way if the left and the right understood that the problem was at the top. And, you know, we see it so clearly today how money influences both parties, and we go nowhere. The roots of the problem are here. 18 big international banks control the governments of the world. And they control the people, they control the corporations of the world, and the businesses of the world. Because we're all, and you know, all 7 billion people, we're in debt to those banks. We're in debt. We're slaves to debt. There are people going out and doing jobs that they hate so they can pay their debts. And of course, those banks, those big international banks, the 18 of them, they have a bank themselves, a central bank for themselves, called the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, right? And that's the bank that told the Canadian bank, which was a public bank, and they told them you had to stop issuing public money for healthcare and things like that. And so Comer recently, you know, tried to sue them, but their court wouldn't let them do it. And, you know, so yeah, we got a problem. It's the governments aren't in control. The banks are in control of your economy. It's a macroeconomic problem. So things like co-ops, you know, that y'all talk about, democratize the workplace, which is kind of scary to business people a little bit. You know, start your own business, damn it. Don't leave mine alone. And but you know, co-ops, local currencies, what else? Public banks. These are all microeconomic solutions. They are not macroeconomic solutions. They are microeconomic strategies for surviving within the current system. That's why we do them. It doesn't make them a bad thing. That makes them a good thing, because, you know, Band-Aids are important, you know, and because it's addressing the pain where the pain is happening. But that doesn't solve the pain maker. And the pain maker is the macroeconomic problem that we're talking about with monetary reform. World around. It's a world around problem. Well, I'm going to have some more videos on this, but I hope you got something out of this. The BMRC's rules are coming up before the National Committee to be voted in to make us an official committee, so we can start, you know, pursuing our work. But I felt like I needed to make this video to send to you folks to talk about the misinformation that has been happening out there. And I really want to see the Green Party become the leader of changing the world. And we are a global party, so we are fit for it. But so far, only the Green Party of the United States and the Green Party of UK have monetary reform. And MMT is also working on positive money. They're going into their chapters too, trying to get them to turn away from monetary reform. I'm sorry, that's, I'm not going to say much more about that. You can determine it yourself. And Have a good day. Greens and growing.